Hi, everybody. I'm so excited today to have my beautiful teacher, Danny Castro, on with us. It's very exciting for me. I've been with Danny since I was 30. I'm 52 now, so it's been about 22 years since I first met him through a mutual friend in San Francisco. And it's been just such a really, really special journey. And Danny has something to share that I haven't found with anybody else. He really touches my heart so deeply and genuinely. And I thought it would be just really nice to be able to share him with other people. So thankfully, he graciously said yes. So I'm Kai Shanti. We have Ellen Steinfeld
Right.
on today, too.
I
And I actually met Alan through Danny 20 some years ago in Washington Square Park when he was interviewing Danny. So
yes, I actually
nice
want to.
reunion.
I want to show that clip of me and Danny in Washington Square Park, and then we can go back to our regularly scheduled program. Here I am in Washington Square Park with Danny. Can you see that okay on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, here we are, Danny. What year was this, Kai?
Well, I'm thinking if I met Danny when I was 30, it must have been, it must have been 20 years ago.
All right, here we are, me and Danny 20 years ago. Oh, wait, why is there no sound? Do you hear a sound?
It's muted. It's muted, Alan.
Oh, wait.
I think it was
now it's unmuted.
I think it was introduced by Elliot.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was introduced to Danny by Elliot, and I think what I have to do is get my speaker thing. Let me see if this.
I think it was good you unmuted it.
All right, let me see if this works now. No, I don't know why it's not showing up. I think it's my mic here that internal speakers. Let me try this. Okay, here we go. I got it now. Okay, this is a few years ago, Washington Square Park.
But it was Minetta.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome to New Realities. My name is Alan Steinfeld. I'm sitting here in Washington Square with Danny Castro, and
you turn it up a little, Alan.
Part of a holistic expression. Part of, I guess it goes back to Ramana Maharshi, but you're very much from the streets in New York, which I appreciate. I mean, we talked for hours the other day, and I can't remember one thing you said. I mean, does that happen? I know it touched me. It really touched me in a way that went deeper than the surface. So
it's not the stuff of logical memory. It's not the stuff of there's another memory of longing and yearning. And you see that your own spiritual path has been one of yearning.
Right. Yearning for what?
There's not so much as that there's a draw. You understand that there's a deep dissatisfaction with the life as you're living. And in everything, there may be some quest or pursuit you have, but as soon as you get the object of your pursuit, you then go back into this mode of dissatisfaction, pretending to be on the surface temporarily satisfied.
Yeah.
But still this yearning is there. And you see in yourself this India exploration, the desire to understand, the adaptation of Buddhistic logic, this whole alternative way of being for you has been a path that you've created. It's revealed a kind of deeper yearning within you.
Yeah.
Whether the forms themselves can satisfy that yearning has been a question.
I'm yearning for my own self. I'm yearning to know who I am. And there's been traditions along the way that have seemed to access parts of the deeper self. And
this translation of why you're yearning is a modulator of your mind.
Sure.
The mind can't see how deeply it's yearning. If it sees how deeply it's yearning, it dissolves in acquiescence to that. It sees it has no reality. So the mind's only reality is to obstruct you from seeing that depth. So you see that your attempts to find some depth in your life through these different paths you've adopted are really reflective of an inner longing within yourself. Right? But the mind's eye is to organize itself according to these paths that it chooses.
And
But it finds a failure in each of the paths that it chooses. Each of the pursuits, it comes back to square one. Each of the marriages, each of the love affairs, each of the expressions, you know that there's still something deeply dissatisfied.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It doesn't just spiritual. It has relationships or career. That longing, and I have and when I've done something, when I've accomplished something, there's a deep satisfaction, and then the longing arises again.
And let's see why.
And why?
That longing is intelligent, even though they're attempting to psychologically deal with it and get rid of it and reward it away. That longing is, in fact, the deeper energy of what you are.
Well,
It doesn't matter who you are.
wait, sorry, what's that?
Having rational,
Sorry. Well, nothing has changed since that time, I think.
Well, we are living a life. Now, there's a logical life that we live. When we're born, we have identity. There's a date that we're born, and there's a date that we supposedly are dying and die, and that's us. But as you explore the life, then you're not as bound to the organized you. As you discover something, like I use the phrase there, that I get information years ago that I had colon cancer on the phone, and immediately I flash back to the Brooklyn hospital where my father had colon cancer. And I'm a kid in the room, and it's kept secret and quiet. But then the cancer, then I get the news I have cancer, and it flashes me back, not to a literal father or a story I literally knew, you see, but the cancer introduced me to a human being I never met before. The story of father was the reality. I saw a father who happened to be a person. But all his friends, even strangers, could meet him in 5 minutes, and they would meet a person who happens to be a father. For me to experience happening to be a son, okay, and happening to be a father, and you see that there was a parallel world all along. But what that does is the eye releases the story from the literal. And as it gives a life to your father and your mother, you see, there were people who were doing their version of parents. Right. You understand? Okay. But they were people first. And everyone in the neighborhood knew them. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that they were schmoes who were doing their version of parents. Okay. But you discover that 50 years later or 60 years later over some actual, and it seems to need to be accident to get past your rational mind.
So then who are we without this rational mind? I mean, what you said in that little talk, I think I got a deeper level of it, but we don't need to define ourselves, even though you may have defined yourself for a moment in relationship to your father, but the definition is...
All I'm saying is that basically what everyone knew, you discover. And I say, when you discover something, there is a dormant aspect of your being that is, we'll say your brain that is awakened.
Right.
And now what it took away from you and your relationship to your parents was empathy. And the empathy was that even those people who were Shugana, they looked after you. And how heavy that must have been for them. That's not part of our individual measure, how heavy we were to the people who were caring for us. You understand? And all the flaws. So then you see a grid that you're in, but as soon as you see it, you go from history to mystery. And you go from literal parents to kind of coming out of poetry, where it's in flux. So you see that the boundaries of history, a historical you, are based on the ego identity.
Well,
but there are moments.
No, I just want, and Kai, jump in. I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
So I'm saying that you perceive the story. So now I'm seeing that living and dying are simultaneously occurring. As a matter of fact, you see the simultaneity. It's not only a future event of supposed death, but inherently in the moment is living and dying. And it resembles like breathing in, out and breathing in. It's a natural phenomenon that is taking place. You perceive living and dying, which is resisted in the world. The avoidance of that experience is part of the continuity.
But has things changed for you? Have these realizations, like that was 20 years ago, you could be saying the same thing to me now, or maybe you've dropped to another level in your own awakening. I'm curious about that level of evolution in you because you see that bigger picture.
Well, I think that, Danny, it's interesting what you experienced with your mother, and because for me it's a radical perception to be able to, for people to see how they were to their parents, not just how their parents were to them. What causes that?
When you mention my mother now, somehow my mother, who was to karmically die in Brooklyn as her family before her, fell in love with Mary. And in falling in love with Mary, she completely left the karmic equation of mother and came out here to live and to die. So, but I was in the sadhana by that time, so she joined our community. So if you can imagine your parents joining your community that you were in. Okay, so then I had to play son, but it became then a theater between us, and that was the sadhana, was that how does teaching go on? It's not a literalized teaching, it's a theater. And supposedly the premise of everyone who engages in the theater or the movie together is that they're all on board creatively, whether they're the janitor or the queen, that somehow when we're making a creative act together, there's a common consciousness or agreement. And it is not the literal world that you're bringing to the creative act. When you see that your life is the creative act, it is not literalized any longer. So here I am then with my mother, who's both living and dying, who becomes this and that within a kind of inquiry, a creative inquiry, a Krishnamurtian inquiry or whatever. And yet it's just people. But the climate is theater and revelatory. So then when my mother then goes, when something does happen after years, when it was a real beauty, a thing of beauty and remarkableness, that there was a dialogue in the community as if it was normal, that included mothers and parents or whatever, but as they entered into the place, they ceased to be parents.
Mm-hmm.
They were friends in a situation. And the inherent friendship was the creative act together. It normalized. So you acted with people as if you knew them always, but you may have known them for a month or two or a year or an interaction. So the sadhana was the basis of the meeting. And yet there was normal interactions. But the normal interactions in retrospect were creative acts. To interact with your mother in the sadhana, she's not your mother. You're not the son. Those are, you're assuming identities in the story, but it's more like the acting studio, where somehow you have to do something to your literal identity to be able to soulfully assume the identity of what is happening in the person you're assuming.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we entered into a situation then where theater was the norm in our everyday life. And so there would be moments where that would be accentuated. But let's say that one night my mother was ill and the woman who came in to treat her gave her 2 shots of this fentanyl and threw her into a weird space before she'd passed, where for a while she was singing Frank Sinatra songs or Tony Bennett songs on the bed, rolling around. for a day or two that she was so whacked or stoned what this did to her system. But then one day they called me in the morning and she was there and it was very much almost like an orangutan snarling on the bed saying, I should have killed you at birth. And even though I was this big stalker and this and that, my hair did stand up on end. And I was making Woody Allen jokes, this is my mom, folks, and this and that, retaining the sadhana. But that threw me. Even though I did act out, and they then finally called the hospital and they picked her up, and she was kicking them and cursing them and going bonkers in the hospital. Until one evening, Mary went there around 3 a.m. and fed her Jello. And she then cried and said she wanted to come back home. And she had kind of remembered herself. So then she came, and I think about 3 days later she passed, but lots of folks were here to see her off. So thank goodness it was restored. The kind of sadhana or grace was restored. So you did see the history and the mystery coincidentally.
But who are these aspects of our personality, and what
I
is?
feel that must have been a real conversation that we're having before I was born.
Yeah.
And, the time period was one of recession and a really tough period. They were arranged marriage and all this, So let's say all of a sudden one word that gets you, that even transcends my own history. I should have killed you at birth. I think she was planning something like that, probably, because she must have been in tough shape as a young woman in a forced situation. And so let's say it then puts you into the movie of your life, not the literalness of your life, where there's a you before there's a you, where you're in the circumstance, and it's not just this invented history that my folks came from here, like I'm describing them. You're in the midst of it, without an identity, without a story. So I feel that when you experience the history of you as a mystery, you weren't there, you were an observer, but you saw the dynamic that was happening. When you re-enter the story, let's say as I'm there with my mother, I'm doing son. But for that moment when she screamed that out, I wasn't doing son, I was son. And so let's say that as you perceive the life as a sadhana, as a journey, and you see yourself in literal situations, you then see living and dying as a phenomenon that is natural. But that in the social system, the systemic logic, death is to be feared, warded off, fought with, or whatever. And they've made it knowable. But then once you perceive that dying and living are inherently in the life and in the moment, you re-enter the story from a different place. And I feel then you see much of the rules and much of the structures and much of the things that are happening are organized around the resistance to that perception.
Danny, what is it that allows you to have that perception?
Almost, well, you kind of have to fail. You have to have enough discipline and then fail. So let's say I studied Buddha for years, and then personally I know that I'm yearning inside it the same way, and it's still, but it gives me a coda. But there is also a dichotomy happening. So that dichotomy in the world is failure, but in the creative sense, it's the failure that allows another dimension to take place. So historically, even in creative acts, it's the failure in music that allowed a breakthrough. It wasn't seen as failure. It meant that you had to exhaust a certain phenomena or a way of seeing or a way of doing. And that way of doing was always around the survival, ensuring the survival and the continuity. So those of us who fell in love, who ran away, we interrupted the logic of continuity. So there is something creatively in Mushugana, in having a feeling and trying something where the world would punish you for that.
Is there a new way to operate? Is there another mechanism? And so we don't have to go through the down, or is this just part of the cycle of being?
Well, it's the cycle of being in one sense. There's a survival gene that seems to dictate continuity.
Right.
So let's say you're organized then into family, marriage, literalness, the literalness of it. But as you go into the literalness of it, then the social construct is forcing you to repress and suppress genuinely creative feelings. So then they make you, while you are maintaining a literal, you have to hide the evocative. And so you see the duality, then it has a date with an incident in the future, because you see then it makes what would have been healthy, makes one into a sneak. And or they have to they live, that their actual life is being lived in suppression and repression, while the expression is one of a literal persona who's continuing.
But if you could change that, what would you say to
Let's
children
say
and parents?
the change is waiting in the wings.
Right.
It's not dependent on you, but there's an accident waiting. And there's an accident waiting that will undo your whole circumstance that you're in. And it can be a schmaltzy's dumb love affair that you run into. And it may undo 20 years of structure and circumstance.
Is that what we're looking at right now happening in Washington with all this, protest?
No, but let me say, when I perceive my father through the cancer and flashback 60 years or so, there's forgiveness in the eye. The eye forgives the story. He wasn't my father, but he had to hide his life. Okay, so then you see the whole parallel life was almost identical to the life that you've lived. What you could never have given this guy, you could never have given him the hipness of your own. You could have never given the magic that you were longing for. But then you discover another dimension that literalized the parents. It frees the eye and it frees the story. Once it does that, you re-enter the story from a different place where death is no longer the medium. We're in it now. In this kind of coronavirus, we are in an extended day as life, where time is being, you can shape it this way or that way. I'll see you at 3 o'clock instead of 2 o'clock. There's no, and it looks like it's gone by so quickly. Like this. But quickness is no longer the quickness of logic. It's the quickness of experiential, a year here that has been up in the air and yet is creating itself in its own way. So let's say when you then have the theater of your life and you re-enter the story, then you kind of understand how are you literally in that story. And you see that there is a dialogue happening as we discuss with the children or whatever, that is even based on memory. Once you have freed the literalness of death waiting, and you see that living and dying is a healthy association, that's happening anyway. And that's what your immune system has been dealing with anyway. We were discussing it the other day. I don't know that the immune system favors living over dying. I think it's a fair judge. With the job that it has, is that it keeps it, so at this point in time, it has freed the story, and you see all the systems that you're in are based on the fear of death. I've just received the ashes of my daughter from San Francisco or the Bay Area, that she died of COVID. But she had pneumonia and other things. But then the things that they've sent me, her friends, that she was a radio performer and she put on concerts or whatever she did. And now I just got 1,000 photographs of her life
Mm.
who's my daughter, who I gave a piggyback into Prospect Park. All of a sudden, there's this persona who visits me as this person, but they have a life. And to some degree, the life resembled my own life of going to India and coming from here and going through all of this. But for me, I think that the first going to India came out of an inner despair.
Mm.
And then I think that when I finally did get to India and was doing mantras in Rishikesh in the Himalayas there, and probably pretty sick, we were kind of a dedicated crew. I probably had dysentery and sick. Again, I woke up one morning feeling like a real schmuck. You understand? Okay, that I'm doing mantras with dysentery in the Himalayas. You understand? Would have been a great movie I would have loved to have been in. But then you wake up in one morning and you feel like you're full of shit. It's like, and I can't say it was full of shit, but I felt it was full of shit for me to be in that scene.
Mm.
And so, and even when I went to the guru, he wanted $20 rent. So it even made it more full of shit for me. But that threw me into a kind of despair because I was really now stuck in India. And I had thrown the life away coming out of America and New York and whatever the situation towards this experience. And I think that that level of failure for me, whether it was literal failure or not, it was a failure within the self where it threw you to despair. And you viewed the world from that despair. And that despair then introduced me to an accidental meeting with Doctor, who was also in despair. When I got there, he was arguing with his wife on the front of the house there. So that he was also trapped in a circumstance as he was making breakthroughs.
That's what Alan was asking about.
Oh,
who
yeah.
Your teacher
Your
was.
doctors, who was your teacher?
Dr. Kaushik was mentioned to me.
And what did he do to turn around this despair for you or show you a deeper level of it?
It wasn't, it was basically, we were in a similar space. So just the immersion, the association, the conversation or the exploration, because then it would get weird. It was a hippie scene, people would come by, but they were also ruining his life because he was also an Indian doctor with a family. And as you were getting more radical people visiting for him, one who would take her clothes off and ridicule the people all the time and yell at them or whatever. There was one time when the village came and started to throw stones and ran Doctor out of his house. So that ultimately changed the whole perspective when he still had a family and a home and they still lived there or whatever. But then he then had to, that's when then all the people met who were broke and hanging out and exploring darshan. See? And then out of that, there was an invitation for him to come to America. And then I saw him a second time. I had left, when I first left Doctor, and I got home and knocked on my door in Brooklyn. Then I saw my wife, my daughter, this Jamaican boyfriend or husband, and another guy in there. So the illusion that life was waiting for you in a fixed state. So while I had the experience, it had the experience also. They were free to have a new life. What would have shocked me a year or so ago, coming back and my home was no longer my home, my family was no longer my family as a possessive, and it was all agreeable. Yes, I went to pick up a sport jacket, a pair of sneakers, but then around that period of time, I found that there was a woman who was waiting for me who I hadn't even realized from a few years ago. She had gone to Israel and married this guy, but she had remembered, we had glanced at each other for a split second. And she heard I was coming back to America and she was waiting. And so somehow out of that conversation with Doctor, the dissolution of the form as if the history was your life and it would be waiting for you. You see, life had moved on without you.
Mm.
And if I read my mother's diary at a certain time, I meet a woman, not my mother, and a hot woman. Woman who was free, something that would have violated me, who was free to have lovers, free to do this, free to do that. Okay. So something you wish for yourself, you kind of were shocked, but you understand that in reading the diary, there's no mention of me.
Mm.
So you see a human being who happens to be your mother. And you see that they have a life that you had no clue that you would have accused them of, you would have fought them with. They would have been failed women if it was revealed. And yet is what makes the world go round. The world is in flux.
Mm.
So then you meet mystery over history. So that conversation with Doctor was one event where there was around 3 a.m. we were talking and we had a wall in front of us, and then we heard a policeman beating up a peasant because they ran each by a bicycle into each other. So Doctor stood up, and then I stood up alongside him, and when the cops saw him, he stopped beating, and because he was going to arrest the guy also. So Doctor said either beat him or arrest him, but you cannot beat him and arrest him. Okay, just because we're witnesses to it. And you see that once they became aware that there was an observation at all, everyone's character changed and they all acted human for a moment.
Mm.
Then we sat down and then Doctor said to me, can you see it? And he opened his arms like that, his hands, and there was a full moon sort of behind his head. And that was just that. There was no learning. Although it was the same kind of Krishnamurtian logic, it was our association and friendship that opened up and the similarity. So it seemed that the immersion and friendship. So that's what I meant when I got back to Brooklyn and knocked on the door. The conversation with Doctor had me come from a different place and knocking on the door rather than literally owning the place and my place.
Mm.
The place became more of a movie than a literal history. And somehow everyone in the picture was human.
Danny,
Where-
was that like one moment of perception when Doctor did that, or was it over time that you had
No, that was for me. I left before the explosion happened for him. So I was there almost privately with him for a while. So these were moments when we would take walks and the conversation would just unfold. And it was as if it was natural, as if it was talking to yourself about things. So it wasn't an immersion, but that one seeing was a kind of event that I remembered when I knocked on the door. And I saw something in front of me resembled the cops or whatever that we saw in India there. But then as I left, he went through some real tough times as more and more heavy duty people came to visit. The dichotomy between an Indian doctor with a house and now someone who was making a breakthrough perceptively shifted. But I think it was the experience in America that changed him, not the coming to Woodstock. And we had to, so I got a letter that Doctor was coming or whatever. So I met him at the airport a year or so later. I was already living with Astor in California. And so we then came back to Brooklyn and I got the letter that he was coming. And he got an invitation to talk at Cornell.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality was he was perfectly broke. We first had to live at a little place in the Bronx. We met, and then in Woodstock, and then a tent in Woodstock, and so on. And then, so this unfolded. A community of friends unfolded and started to become literal,
Well, I'm just curious, though, is your work seems to be about taking aspects of the personality and seeing the bigger picture to transcend it, but the personality is always creating, maybe you would say, problems to get the deeper self to be awakened. Is that?
Let's say this thing that we're sharing now will be there in memory. By accident, you'll have an experience and you'll, holy shit, and you'll remember the conversation. And you'll remember the conversation of my mother and this and that. And so you'll start to see the thread that runs through the story. So as I explore and I see and we share even a moment together, even if I meet you in the grocery store accidentally, the dumb conversation will manifest in some way because our relationship and your life is now around the journey, the sadhana.
Mm.
You're assuming an identity of Alan,
Mm-hmm.
but the identity is almost like an Uber driver. Understand? It knows the directions to go or whatever, but there is a different framework that it's coming from.
Mm.
So it has a relation there. Friendship or relationship becomes the medium.
Yeah.
So you see that somehow you've taken up expressions that have relationship as the basis. Even in absence, even if you're speaking on the air and you don't have a clue as to who you're speaking to, you see that there may be a molecule of what was said or shared that enters into the person's literal reality.
Mm. Yeah.
So let's say once you perceive the parents as people, something has happened where the karma has interrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And so now their parents as theater. So you see that you've gone from karma to dharma perceptively.
Mm-hmm.
And so when karmic time is still controlling and continuing, but when the continuity is interrupted perceptively, you see you come more from a creative act than a literal one.
Mm.
And you see that your identity is more flux than it is a literal identity. Once you see your parents as people, you also see a parallel life that you are in. So there's an of course moment. They say, of course, that's what happened. And now you understand. But for you to be able to see that, you have to be human.
Right. Well,
So the human is not as charged towards the profit margin of continuity.
Well, Kai, what have you gotten? Been with Danny for 22 years. What's been your process in this relationship, in this teaching for your greater awakening for yourself? I'm just curious.
Oh, well, wow. I don't even know if I could put that into words, but
well,
Danny, I mean, just in my current situation,
yeah,
he's given me a completely new perspective on where I am living with my ex-husband and my 2 children. I mean, that's just in my current life.
Look, if they offered you this movie, Alan,
yeah,
and you go into the movie and you then have 2 kids to care for and an angry, pissed off Christian husband, and they say, and you also will be in that community, which is kind of pretty literal. I said, you want to give it a shot? Because okay, but you're presuming in the movie that the others are also acting.
right.
That they're not literally from Pennsylvania. They're not literally white people. They're not literally black people. They're doing black people. They're doing white people. They're doing Pennsylvania.
Right.
So I presume our lady friend here,
yes,
through an interaction with me, then restores some of the creative connection. It's not completely full, where she can say, I don't need this crap. Come on, get out of here. Right. That is completely because there's a nuances.
Yeah. So
then you are kind of through a relationship. You know, there was one beautiful, I think they made a film of it, where he's in the concentration camp. What's his name?
Was it Fig? faithless or?
No, in Venice. He went to Venice eventually there, but where he's the only human being in the place
Mm.
in Auschwitz. And they keep him in the shower, and someone just came in and smacked him in the face. He doesn't, and he's completely literate, intelligent guy. So you experience being a stranger in a strange land, or 12 years a slave, where you're a developed person, and because of the situation, they enslave you.
Mm.
So that you then have to repress and hide what you cannot repress and hide: your intelligence, your humanity.
Mm.
Okay. So you understand that there are other forces at play. And the literal reading of the play is, if you can do this thing, can I enter in Kai's story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where for me, she's free to leave or stay or go, or that's your call if you want to try it. So for me, there is a creative feeling from the get-go that you're doing Mother, you're doing ex-wife, you're doing Pennsylvanian, or whatever role that you're doing, but your relationship is to Shanti. So you have a secret life hidden from them, which they may think is stupid or crazy or whatever. But you see the effect that you've had on the family. You reveal the deceit and the deception that ran the story. And that ran the story of a Christian construct, that there was a difference between being religious and having a religion. So you understood the religion then started to become an agency that dictated and formed towards a continuity, but the religious mind was more like a stranger in a strange land. You had the feeling, therefore you couldn't do the literal. And so what you're imparting to your kids is the feeling as they're going to go into a literal world. So I felt that basically you were then seeing through the friendship, through that 1 hour or 2 hours that we would spend at times. And they heard you also. There were voices in the background. I know they hear you, so I kind of, even though I don't see it or whatever, and I'm talking to 20 people at that time, they're all individuals to me, and I am who's dying of cancer. You see how we're discussing with Jai as living and dying is obviously in the circumstance that she's in.
We do a group Zoom call every
We
Sunday.
do a Zoom call on Sundays. And so we have friends from all over. And so we have a friend then who used to own the Bitter End in New York and Cafe Wa years ago, and is now on the hill of Krishnamurti Zohai. And yet is just Jai, the woman that we knew from Woodstock and everywhere else. And she's sick and she's alive and she's vital. She's giving advice to famous people, but at the same time, she's living and dying literally. She's 83. And we have created just our theater of conversation of living and dying, and where it's your call to some degree. Are you still into it? The conversation, why she can't advise famous people completely because they have agents that dictate what they can hear or see. And so they're in that world. So then I'm meeting people who are in different expressions, but it's around the same friendship that we share. We share this milieu for a period. But then there is something about the situation you're in is a choice. Not the choice of the ego of choosing this or that, but it's the creative choice that you're making. So Kai has available a world to her. And it is also true that those who are kind of in a spiritual world or a creative world do come home to a tough scene as it literalizes.
Well, does that?
Because those who are literalized with you are not sharing with this other scene with you. So I think that Kai is doing something remarkable. She's sharing both literal motherhood, someone who will make you breakfast and this and that, but also sharing the sadhana, where it's not such an organized religion, but it is a transmission of feeling. The transmission of feeling then may assume different identities. So for a moment, I'm not only with Buddhism, I'm more with Buddha. I'm not so much with the Christianity as it evolved. I'm more with the schmoiness of Jesus and the kind of conversation we would have had. And so I'm with the conversation we would have had. That was very deep, where you would have stopped what you were doing if you saw Buddha on the side of the road. And so simply stopping what you were doing because something else was more important to explore, when in fact the thing that was more important to explore becomes your life expression.
Mhm.
Well,
So
did
then
that-
you also see when the rabbi asked me, are you a Jew? Or the priest said, are you Catholic? And then I said, I'm a human being now. You re-entered the story. Who happens to be Jewish, who happens to have Christian in me, but I'm human first. And so the human doesn't join the religion so easily. Even if he tried, it would be rather silly. The human then assumes the religious expression. But they have a relationship with the energy to some degree in their everydayness, in their second nature to them now. It's not that they're getting ahead or they're overcoming this. Even their faults are no longer presumed with getting rid of them or changing them or shifting them. It's with seeing them. And you see that the faults that you have assumed throughout time have allowed you to survive in a literal world. Even though you were being punished for being a schmuck or a fool or a failure or whatever, you saw that somehow you were protecting something human in yourself. So I use an axiom when I was a kid. I quit school and I joined the Navy, and I was really into this movie aspect of it. But then once I got into the killing and field, and you couldn't just say to them, hey, I don't like it anymore. I'd like to quit, and please. What a schmucky idea that would be, right? That's what I did. Once I had the adventurous part of it, I was the ship and this, and there was movies, and you had girlfriends in Italy and Spain, whatever. It was the movie. But then once it literalized where you had to, you saw that you were a stranger in a strange land again. But that you would also be punished for being a coward. You would be punished for being a schmuck. That would be proof. And you understood so let's say in an initial journey, what you have to go through to then have where it then blossoms, where a simple conversation with God, it's the failure of the mantras, it's the failure of Hinduism, it's the failure of the yoga and this and that, because you realize the same schmuck was still trying to be happy and get ahead and make a buck or whatever. So it was bringing that logic again to all the systems that it was running into. How to make a buck off of Buddhism, how to feel better. But you see, if in fact you get the Buddha, you may in fact feel like complete shit as a healthy state, because you are in a complete shit. You understand? Okay. So let's say when you realize, if Kai realizes that it's completely full of shit, then she's free to go. Now, what would free to go mean? There will be look, if the house is on fire, you don't have to worry if there's an apartment waiting for you.
Right.
So my feeling is it's just no longer a place for you to live consciously or as a human being.
Does that help you, Kai? Does that shift your, well, you've had that awareness. I'm not saying this is new.
She's had that awareness. Everyone has kind of offered her some kind of sense but she's also true to something that's happening, it seems.
Right.
Yes, because and when you ask how Danny helps, I mean, just him reflecting that to me weekly after being immersed in the scene so much, it just allows me to pull back and see the truth of it. I mean, that's everything, and also that I couldn't leave before I'm done doing here what I came here to do.
Until you were free to go. So somehow,
I'm free to go.
Even those who are busting your chops still have an attachment to you.
But where would you go anyway? Because the situation is an internal one. It's not an external one.
Yeah,
way.
but no, it's manifested in the external. You then say, oh, what about the rent? What about the place? So most kids could leave their families then if that was the case. So you see that somehow there is a linear continuity
Mm. Mm.
that is normal.
Mm.
Something has to happen that changes the story. But it is waiting. So I'm saying there is an incident waiting. You would love there to be where in fact there's a genuineness, the genuineness that allowed the babies, the genuineness that allowed the origins may still be awakened, where it doesn't have to be literally married, where it's still looking out for each person creatively. So there is a hey baby moment we've been discussing over the last few months, where when I felt that I was going, when I got the news of cancer, then I was going to go to the place in the Himalayas that we had there. So death was no problem for me. And it freed me from the literal story. But then Mary saying, hey, baby, why don't you hang around? Hey, baby is a mantra. If there's a genuine invitation, would I come back from dying for a deep love affair? I think pretty much clearly always, but it had to be genuine. So somehow the next phase after the dying process, and the dying process for you was in the divorce, and then in the need for each other to demean the love that they shared in order
What
to
was
get
that,
out of
Danny?
the circumstance.
The need for what?
There's kind of a need then to kill the other person that they were just in love with and lived with or whatever. And you can see what's happening. The mechanics of something is they're attempting to get free of the story where the other person is forcing them to contemplate too deeply.
Yes.
And it's hard to survive a literal workaday life if you have to contemplate something deeply. So let's say each of us will have an effect on our partners where even in memory there will be contemplation because it was a true thing. But it may not have been such a survival thing. And what is the difference? Is that the survival is a secondary expression to the true thing, that it's a true love first. But you see in the world, survival is the predominant structure of continuity. But you also see that there will be memory, that Kai is not only literally Kai, the memory of Kai is also Kai. And so when you're doing nothing and you're not meeting them in the same anger or hurt, there's a memory of you. What you're sharing even with the children is the memory. As they assume a literal identity, the memory of a coexisting world that may seem naive in the literal world, but is now inherently part of them. That where you're not dominated, we'll say the survival is the continuity. But then you see that there are dimensions of life. One aspect of it is continuity, but as you see other creative dimensions, the continuity is no longer the dominant force. It's like having a theater where you have to pay rent, but you also understand that your main focus is the creativity that's going on. Supposedly the creativity will pay the rent. At times that's deeply naive.
But there has to be a truth to that, right? I mean, isn't that what we're basing all of this on?
Well, you'll find yourself in different worlds. I say that fellow who was brilliant and gets smacked in the face in Auschwitz, and people are pushing him around. He doesn't even know why. He doesn't have any system like that. He wrote that book. He survived it and went back to Venice. But he described this thing of where if you're human, you may be punished. Because Primo Levi is his name, an Italian poet and writer, but he describes that experience from a person who was kind of deeply human in himself. And I also then go back to those moments. I described that in this service when I joined the Navy as a kid, and then I said, holy shit, I'm in a weird scene, where it became pronounced. And you can't just say, hey, I don't like it any longer. Take it easy like an American citizen. But they kicked the living shit out of you and made you a coward and made you a rat. And what I would go through then as a young kid, a young guy, I went to my friend in Queens who had hepatitis, who used drugs. And I went there and I spent a week shooting drugs to give myself hepatitis, so that I would be, so that when I went back there, then they said, oh no, you're not that sick. Then I had to drink for another 4 or 5 days or whatever to get myself. But I was also managing my health in my dumb mind's eye. I was trying to make myself look sick enough for them and yet well enough for me to get the hell out of it. So let's say I then, in retrospect, something happens to you where you see that throughout your life, you've been juggling the theater and the literal. And you understand as it literalizes. And yet, to some degree, I had to go through hell in that circumstance. But there was a determination that would be there also, that was now part of me. And it wasn't stubbornness or determination, but my main intent was to get out and to get out honorably.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever terms they had, I don't even know what damn terms they had. You knew you were a Jew boy for creating problems, or you were some schmuck or ballbuster or whatever. But basically, the premise was you didn't like it any longer. You were a free person. You were being punished because you were a free human being. And the reason that you didn't like it any longer, because instinctively you knew it wasn't just a dumb job. It was inhuman. So somehow you then I located a father that I didn't know who became an artist, who did murals. But then I saw that they tried to find the human work, the human expression that wasn't slavery or whatever. So you meet parallel lives in your own life.
And is this what you, when you work with people, then you are reflecting where they are, but it's also enriched with your own story. So
it depends on if the person comes deeply with a passion to see, not that it's an accidental byproduct of the situation. So it depends on the desire level, because it is a desire level that I have to meet. Once that's there, it dictates. So let's say I'm getting ready now to go. I'm hanging with this love affair with Mary and also this Meshuggah scene that's happening around us, but I'm also seeing it more from the lens of the other side, looking at the story. Mm-hmm. So there may be a cancer, or maybe a fall, or there may be a reason for it, but I see that that's happening anyway. And it's almost like we studied homeopathy, where it's leaning towards living and dying. And so that was the Hippocratic oath, is not to interfere with processes, but to care for something otherwise. So I feel I'm in that process where dying is in the story. Mm. And so then I'm seeing dying in the story.
But dying to be reborn in a sense as well, right? You have to acknowledge that passing.
If Kai's boyfriend says, I'm so sorry, baby. That's the mantra you would like to hear. I'm so sorry, baby, for putzing around with you. Hmm. So basically, there was a true feeling, and then there's a literal story. Hmm. So when the person then took up the literal story and had to suppress the feelings in order to carry on, you see the feelings are still there. So that's one of the reasons you can't just go or not go or whatever. Your relationship is to those feelings also. So if the audience boos you enough, you're kind of free to leave. But if the audience is cheering you and laughing and booing and giving you that, you somehow have a relationship to a creative act. When your life is now no longer determined by the self, but the self is an aspect of you, not the determination. You see that Kai's life is a creative life. And probably there are moments of realization. So Shanti was an attempt to shed some light on this process that's happening for her. But you see, real time can kick your ass. And when real time forces you to pay the bills, it makes the way you're living into a real schmucky scene, even though it's attracted to you by that. So the literalization of Kai is a dumbing down of Kai.
Mhm.
But the literal Kai would not have hung out there.
So what does Kai or anyone do with that?
The doer is not so important. The seer is important. The seer may do. So I feel that Kai, through our interaction in the last months, to some extent, where the story is also in the wings, hiding in the wings or in the closet or whatever, but it can hear. And I do see that there's a true feeling that ran through the story.
Mhm.
And that Kai has a relationship, and what would be thought of as a sucker for that feeling. But I think that true feeling ran through the story, and that true feeling did create the form that she's in.
Mhm.
So I think that she'll always have a feeling for someone who likes her or loves her, even though it's a hard passage or it's dumb or whatever. I think that she has I think she's made a life out of a relationship to that yearning.
But it's an incubation. I don't want to talk for Kai or any, but it's an incubation in a sense, just like you're saying your life had a lot of intensity and hardship, but then there was this other level of freedom that gave you the perspective on the whole thing. Is that?
Well, we re-entered the story from a different place.
Mm-hmm.
So when you re-entered the story from a different place, the prior life was over.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you were in the same neighborhood, even if you were in the same situation, as if you graduated.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you saw then the conspiracy that you were in.
Mm-hmm.
So you saw it wasn't just the use of something, but that the way it was in the society was organized into continuity.
Mm-hmm.
So the continuous self is you in the organized scheme of the world that we're in. But the evocative you is you in the journey, in the sadhana.
Mm-hmm.
And that evocative you has memory in a different way. And it also has missing.
Mm.
So missing would have been something that we resist in the world, but then missing opens up a doorway creatively, where what we're experiencing now somewhat in the virus is something that has been happening all along. That time is seen from a different place, from a different perspective. So when you look at a movie, you see past, present, and future in the moment.
Mm.
You see things that are hidden from the people in the movie that they will discover, you see.
Mm.
But when you see like that, it's like a Hippocratic oath. The person has to discover it, not know it.
Mm.
So then there is something where you're not spelling out this or that. You're creating an environment of seeing. Because when there is an environment of seeing in relationship, it opens up another doorway of yours.
Can you equate any of this to the political scene, or do we have to stay strictly, not have to, but strictly personal is sort of the area you work in, but there's also a bigger picture, right?
There is a bigger picture that we're seeing, but it's no longer literalized in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we see forces that kind of come closer to representing the human feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But the folks that we meet in the friendship discover an instant freedom
Mm-hmm.
from their own history and from the scheme that they're in.
Yeah.
So then I say, to some degree, we perceive that we are just like an actor, that we're assuming the identity we may put our whole heart in the identity. We may not put our whole heart in the job, but we may put our whole heart in the character that we're assuming. So you see, the creative life is deeper in intensity that way, deeper in loss, but it's not personalized as a possessive.
Mhm.
So let's say from the non-possessive, we're seeing the flux that we're in. It's not being created by the characters, it's being revealed.
Mhm.
Hmm? And there's a revelation of a form that's unfolding. Still, to a large degree, we're in it, but not of it. But if there's a hurt or a feeling that happened, you assume the identity and run into the story. Our relationship is to the human.
Yeah.
And then it's somewhat to the story. If it's completely captured by the story and it loses the human equation, then there's an event waiting.
Mm.
So there are events happening right today that are kind of creating a what the, who the, when the, where the,
Right.
why the,
Right.
as being the real religious question.
Mm.
What the, not even fuck, but just what the fuck, with an exclamation point or a question mark.
Yeah.
When, where, but why is the deeper one. And if you see why, you see it's always been happening all along. These
Yeah.
influences always have been there. But we are still strangers in a strange land. We walk with our pockets with our hands in our pocket. I used to use growing up in Brooklyn, or I'm in Lower East Side, you walk through different neighborhoods. When you walk through the neighborhood, Puerto Rican neighborhoods, you have to worry about getting beaten up, or, when you walk even through the Italian neighborhoods, and the Hasidic Jewish neighborhood, they beat me up, the Jewish Defense League, for walking through there with a Puerto Rican boy once. So you see that wherever the prophet put his head, there was no place for him. You were neither a Jew, you were not Italian, you were not a Puerto Rican, you were not Irish, you were not German, you were you. You assume these identities. But if you had a girlfriend in the Puerto Rican neighborhood, you can just instantly go there and assume an identity. And somehow the families and the friends also assume the identity with you. So having a dopey girlfriend in each of these neighborhoods allowed you access and interest in it.
Mm.
So a feeling allowed you to assume the identity. When the feeling fell away, you were then seen as an imposter.
Mm.
When I was playing commando in the Navy, I was really into it. It was like a movie. But then a moment where you just woke up and saw but I was also in Operation Intelligence Division on the ship, so I saw what the plans were. And once you saw the larger picture again, then you were just no longer a kid in the Navy in a movie kidding around. You saw that you were in what you just called this real meaning of the thing, where you thought it was just to have a good time and meet girls, and you said, no, you had to bomb a village, and you had to do this, and you had to close your eyes if you killed a family or something like that, as if it was normal. Then you understood that you were being punished for being human, but you didn't know it then. They kicked the living shit out of you each time. So I went through a period where having the shit kicked out of you was normal. And sometimes it's not that you defended yourself. Sometimes you would fight that, but basically with the powers that be, you then had a strength of being able to take it without crying or without falling or without bending or whatever. But then, okay. But once that was there, that once you would, and you weren't sticking up for anything literal. It just wasn't the right thing to do. You instinctively knew it.
Mhm.
Somehow in your being, you instinctively knew that you were being forced or bribed into an inhuman expression. And that once you did, that became your norm. So then you had to assume a heroic identity because you were diminishing your humanity. So the more you diminish your humanity, the more you were free to kill and hurt and wound and survive that way. So the more of you were rewarded, because your humanity would have you question what you were in and say, hey, I don't want to do that. That's not the right thing. What a dumb thing to say. Let's not do this. Can you see yourself in a military situation? You say, hey, this is not right. Let's cool it. So you see the person that would have, but it had to be true that you were asking for reflection. It had to be true and obvious to you.
Is there always this odds to our humanity? Can't humanity flourish? Is that too idealistic? I mean,
You see that there are many phases of the humanity. The one is the continuity, and the continuity is based on identity. So there's a literal you with a social security number and a birth date and this, and he has a goal in life to succeed and survive and do well, and generally to have a family or.
mhm,
So that, but you also see how much that is up in the air now,
mhm.
and how what they're really fighting over is to continue that idea that there's a literal life being lived, that the woman having periods is an indication that she's to have a baby, that the men just awakening up, even the bar mitzvah was that you were waking up to having your family or whatever. That was your premise.
Mhm. Well,
Hmm?
look at how beautiful Lotus is there on Kai's lap. I mean, hi, Lotus. I think that's sort of worth it all, right? That kind of humanity, that connection, that beauty, that love. I mean, she has an identity with that, but I don't want to speak for you, Kai, but that's part of the humanity too, right?
Well, but we get a chance to see something that's kind of hidden from Kai.
Oh, does
In a
Lotus
literal
have a
situation,
question?
we see the creative act that's going on. We see what her presence is. We see the remarkableness that the kids have, that energy like that, as if they can talk. She said to me one day, the first time I met her, she said, that's the weirdest thing I ever heard you say.
Right.
I remember that. So
Hey,
I remember everything that's happened in the situation. So as far as I'm concerned, we've kind of interacted with the milieu where we've also introduced the children and Kai to other people.
right. Well, Lotus, did you have something to say? Lotus, were you going to say something? Go ahead.
I lock my finger.
You
No,
what?
she's not. She doesn't.
I lock my finger.
But that's it, Danny, right? That's the beauty.
No, she just said that she wanted Mary to send her a hat.
Oh,
Is that what you said?
She speaks in her own language. Mary, you want to show her the hat?
oh, there's Mary with a beautiful.
Okay, so she just asked Mary for a hat, right?
I got the message.
Ah,
You know, Mary makes her own clothes and stuff. Is there anything you wanted beside a hat?
Lotus. Do you want Mary to make you anything?
Piece of jewelry?
There's my
but is that someone struggling for identity? I mean, or someone to transcend? I mean, little Lotus there. Or is it part of the maturity of being?
Can you see the aura on the wall behind them?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. It would normally look like a stain, but now we see it as an aura.
Right.
So you see that they're regular people keeping it together. That's what all life is. Folks trying to keep it together, doing their thing.
Right.
But you also see that somehow it's also another dimension is revealed that runs through the story.
Mm.
So it's not keeping it together at the expense of the grace.
Mm.
So I see almost kind of pure grace, the attempt at pure grace to happen,
Mm.
and the resistance to it.
Nice. The resistance to, why do we resist the grace?
Because it interferes with the logic of survival.
Mm.
Mm.
So then I say, what happens here periodically is that the continuity starts to determine what happens. So an event happens where there's a hey baby moment. And I think that Kai and the kids will have that competition. Hey baby, are you still into this? Do you still want to try this? You think that Papa's going to come around? So I think that those dopey conversations are not so dopey.
Right.
I think they're creative conversations where you're not prisoners of a story. You don't have a gun to your head. You're doing something because it's the right thing to do as far as you can see. And right thing doesn't only mean survival. It means that you are taking care of the grace.
Nice.
So you are measuring to what degree you have respect in the circumstance that's fighting with you. You still are measuring what level of respect exists.
Mm.
Not literal respect, but somehow the respect of your humanity is in the picture. Because you see, it was a true love. They couldn't have had created the kids unless there was a true feeling.
Yes.
There was a very interesting article in yesterday's Science Times where it measured the health and state of the husband before the birth
Mm-hmm.
in the making love, and the effect, how it translated then into the children's life.
Mm.
And that was medical. That was very interesting, something that, but we also kind of understand that once you free the parents from the parental literal story and you see what was happening before you were born, and you see the conversations and what was going on, that is hidden from you. You have a literal idea of your history, that you come from this place, your folks come from that country or this history. But then when a dumb opening is there, you see you come from more of a mystery.
Is that what you went through when your mother said she should have killed you? I mean, that was dramatic and awful.
And it was she was stoned at the really weirdly, near death at the time.
Mm.
But she was on, the woman called me and says, your mother is going screaming or something. And so it was around 6, 7 in the morning. I went in there.
Mm.
And she was on her hands and knees on the bed. Although when she did pass away, it was the most beautiful. She was really conscious and here. And we did get a kiss goodbye. But then I did, a rabbi came over here. We had to promise him a salmon meal, but he was a real dopey guy. We liked him a lot. And so he gave me a sense of ritual.
Mm.
So I did, spend the evening singing the Tony Bennett songbook of Frank Sinatra to her, walking my baby back home, lying in bed with her, all the songs that she liked.
Mm.
So Meshuggah was the spirituality for us, you understand? But it did have a deep sense of spirituality in it.
Mm.
But where my mother was a person, a human being,
Mm.
who happened to be my mother, not a mother who happened to be a human being.
Mm.
So then the sheer goofiness of something I could never have imagined was lying in bed with my passed away mom, singing, walking my baby back home as a religious song.
Mm. Yeah.
And now with my daughter's ashes that have just arrived, and they sent pictures of her, and she's had quite a phenomena of her own life situation. My memory deeply of her was piggyback in Prospect Park. But then in hearing from her friends what she felt about us and what she was going through and how she felt strongly, and that she seemed to have a pure love, even whatever she was going through. She was a force. So then you meet the story, not as the story, but as the sadhana.
Mm.
So then we have ashes. The ashes that introduced me to her mom from 50 years ago that we've never even had. So the ashes then opened up some remarkable love expressions between people that were living stuck with each other over time, where then the issue became absurd. In the loss of your baby, the issues that you had were absurd.
Mm.
So with the issues allowed separation logically, but then I was hearing from folks from 100 years ago that there was a common feeling. And you see that the history became the mystery. So that is also what is waiting for us. There will be a moment where what you've just gone through in the history and the shtick, you could see hidden in the story is a moment that everyone would stop the shit if this happened or that happened.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can't fake that.
Right. That's the
And I say
real.
why? Because when it truly happens, it reaches a place that the person can't defend against.
Right.
So you see that there is a life of defending against an experience,
Mm.
and it's hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
So to some extent, when you see that, then you can look into the literal situation and you see that the thing that we're talking about, the mutual realization, is not limited to Kai. Kai is giving realization in time. And that is dependent. If they've thrown a love away, or if they've degraded it, or if this happens, there will be moment of missing where there's "I'm sorry, baby" waiting in the story.
Mm.
What an impossible thing. It has to be true.
Mm.
So "I'm sorry, baby" releases the story from the possessiveness, and it allows you access into what actually is happening.
Mm.
So you can modify, you can get glimpses of what is actually happening and try to be a better person. That's the ism of Buddhism or Christianity. But if in fact you have the experience of Buddha, or you have the experience of Judah where you're in the story, not of it, where you're coming from, you see where you were coming from. And you see that it's not contradictory space that you're in, that since there was a kind of awakening for you, and we'll say around San Francisco time, okay, around where you kind of left the Shaktipat situation. I don't know the details of it, but I remember seeing you there, where then you kind of met Johnny D, which changed this situation somewhat for you, and literally changed the situation with Naropa.
Right. So Naropa was my ex-boyfriend. Johnny D was my voice teacher who introduced me to Danny.
Yes, but Johnny D also wouldn't let Naropa be your ex-boyfriend anymore.
What did he do? How
He
did
didn't have to do anything. He's the molecular nature of Johnny D as at the time. So we've had to have I had to grab him in a headlock quite a few times because some of the energy becomes a possessive. So I think that he would have created a stage where you would have looked at the relationship a bit differently, where you were no longer bound to its continuity in the same way. So for some reason, he became a friend of yours, not your husband.
Naropa.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so this is all a complex history. Then Shel Silverstein comes into the story when we're having a retreat, and Naropa. So each person's story, you see the theater of their life. And you see that there was an attraction in Kai that in fact opened up doorways and created expressions for her out of thin air. Not because she had the scholastic history, not because she had the training or background, but an invitation just opened the door and you walked in, and instantly you were in the inner circle of something.
Right.
I think then you are meeting the mystery and history. You start to see that throughout the people that you've been interested in, you see that they were naturals in their own.
Right.
That it was the failure of the scholastic, it was the failure of the traditional that opened up the creative doorway. So I felt that Kai created instant relationships as if they were normal. Like even if it was only a 10-minute relationship, they were acting like it was a 10-year relationship already.
It's true.
So that somehow an attraction to her shifted time, the logic of time. So it was a situation I saw with some like Naropa where they were acting as if they were divorced, to some degree, because I think that she was more, anytime that you tried to make her a possessive
Mm.
or literalize something. So I feel that Kai, from my initial experience, kind of reflected the journey
Mm.
or the energy. And that she herself was seemingly naive, just like I was naive to ask the Navy, look, I don't like it any longer. Can I quit? I did some nice things while I was in it, but I don't like it anymore. So I'm talking from such a schmucky way where these guys are killing people and have atomic bombs and all that shit. You understand? And I'm talking as if I can come and go and I'll see you later and this and that.
Well,
I think that Kai had a feeling like it was normal, that the love affairs that would instantly happen for her and open up a new life or a new expression for her were normal. Somehow the weirdness of a sadhana coming back from India and then something else shifting. And it was shifting over relationships that automatically naive love affairs that had no trip in them. They may have had trip literally, but they never really, any time after coming back from the conversation with Doctor at the time, and it was not, Doctor was also going through his own thing, let me say. So it's not as if he knew what I was going through. He had his own version there in India. He had a wife and a family. In fact, at one point, he did say to me that one of his biggest breakthroughs was a nephew of his who was studying with him, then asked him one day, Chachaji, that means uncle, why don't you learn the Kama Sutra for your wife? And he realized that maybe his wife was having an affair. And even though he may have been having an affair and this and that, that threw him for such a loop. And even though they were apart for a couple of years and they weren't, they had agreed to stay together for the children or whatever, he said that threw him so deeply for a loop that no matter what philosophy he had, what realization he had, it got through everything and reached him. And he went out to a place that the father and family had made for a Hanuman sadhu, a little house on the Yamuna River. And he said for 3 weeks he was doing Christian, forgiving, forgetting. He was trying every Buddhist technique, and it got to him. And he said it got to him because it wasn't a psychological problem, it was true. And so then he at that point, he said that you then became aware of a hurt that was non-causal. And that hurt ran through the organized society. And it looks like the hurt was caused by your parents, or it was caused by this, or it was caused by that. And so there's a psychological quotient to it. But then when you had nothing but to be with the hurt, it wouldn't let you get out of it. It had a revelation in it that he felt that even got better. So then he felt that that was also happening with a Buddha or whatever, that when you came to such a state, then you experienced something that felt like hurt, but it was no longer the hurt of attachment in the world. But it was a hurt that was, as you explored it, not got rid of it. You saw that the idea of getting rid of it was no longer. You explored it. And as you explored it, it started to reveal different dimensions that were hidden in plain sight in your life.
That's interesting. Wow. So
how is that what does that mean? It's interesting. Tell me what you're getting when you say that.
well, if you're able to explore that hurt and delve into it and stay with it, that you see that it's affecting all aspects of your life.
Yeah.
It's not just that situation.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So then as you see the hurt and you explore the hurt, in the regular person, the hurt is a flaw that they have to correct. In the person who can't escape, being with it is almost like, as you explore deeper, doing is no longer the chief force. Then you kind of, as you're exploring the hurt is giving you access to your own being. And as you explore it, you're taking a kind of Hippocratic oath of do no harm, in other words, the difference with the exploration of the soulful aspects of the life is that you can't use it in the literal world that way. So you see the ego tries to own it and become a better person or a better this or do better or make more money or be healthy or do. So even though those have value, they run away from the deeper dimension of the experience. And the deeper dimension, as you explore it, you start to explore a zone where you are not you. You are not you, the social security number. You are not you, the Pennsylvanian. You are not you, the white person or the black person or whatever. You then fly over the yous. And you see that there was a you before there is a you. And so then once you perceive that the literal you is merely a measure of time and space in the circumstance, but that there is you that may not have shapes, may not have forms, may have assumed this, maybe air, maybe this, maybe they assume shapes towards an expression. You may be a memory that allows a poem to be created. You may be, so you see memory and missing. Now it has some resemblance in that state to a Mirabai's missing Krishna and manifesting Krishna into existence by a longing, where the longing is seen as a creative force, not a fault to be gotten rid of psychologically, but the longing is a relationship to something in you. In fact, I was seeing to some degree the other day, I had a traveling infection and seeing it from the immune system's point of view. And you see the immune system doing this juggling act throughout your life that you're really unaware of until something happens. And you see that there's a life being lived that you only have an occasional awareness of because you think the you literally is you. But then all of a sudden you discover through something happening to you, the remarkable juggling act of your body and your being, how it's managing life and death, living and dying. And you see it's also there in thought and being and all in the physical. You start to see almost the immune system as the soul looking out at the story. Without over-schmaltzing it, you start to have experiences of your own soulfulness at play, and you see if Mary's feelings are true, it creates an us out of thin air. So somehow, as long as those feelings are so, and there's no laying out what that means, but there is a laying out in my being. Even the common everyday, schmaltzy everyday becomes a magical day in the circumstance. The goofiness of living a regular life would be as if you were Jesus or someone, you came to earth and now you're watching Netflix and you're doing this sort of stuff. Okay. Where the regular life becomes, in fact, the spiritual life. Perceptively, as a fact, not a future life so much, but that you see the dimensions of the situation you're in. And you start to see also that you're also caring for the geezers in your story also.
Wow.
To some degree, your presence may have saved that family when it was going to break up. Or the revelations of hidden life and that people had to be ashamed of because they were saying one thing in the world and living internally in another way.
Yes.
Where they were afraid, where the literal world was afraid of that intimacy. So then you say, well, hold it, what is happening in a world that then is going through transsexual and gender? And I say, you know, from the perspective of the creative life or the free life or the spiritual life, you assume the identity of the love affair. You don't have an identity beforehand. That's when you met Krishna and the gopis or whatever. It was not sexuality, it was sensuality. Sensuality may express itself sexually, but it's not. So you see that the sexual world and the literal world is an avoidance of the sensual. because then it literalizes the sexuality, so it literalizes identity. So then it makes what would be a creative expression, it makes it into transgender and this and that. It's still trying to, okay. But you see then from the free person, just as if you were writing a movie or putting a movie together, you saw that gender was relative to the true feelings. If the feelings were deep enough, you could assume the gender. But okay. So then you saw that the human being was free to assume identities, but the identity was not historically driven in the same way of continuity. The identity was creatively driven. So when one's life becomes a creative act, the creative act may be longevity. The length of time may come out of the creative act. But the length of time that comes out of being a prisoner in the continuity is qualitatively different, where time is now shifted. Does that make sense, Alan? So
yeah,
let's say,
I'm getting, as you speak, I get more of a sense of your framework of being and working with people, and where you're you know, you're speaking on many different levels at once. And you're speaking to the person, but you're also urging, in a sense, the person to transcend the identification, to see that it is all a theater. It's all, and then when they do that, like they're free in a sense of whatever has trapped them.
no, you look at this, look, so then let's bring it to simple terms. Then whatever Alan does, you freed your mother and your father now. You can't blame them any longer.
No.
So once you saw that they were the same sugar of people as you were,
Yeah.
okay, so the I forgives.
Mm-hmm.
Not I forgive, but the eyes forgive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when it forgives, it releases the story from one's possession. So you see that the worlds that you've been seeking have been parallel to you all along.
Yeah.
And no matter what you did in life, certain experiences couldn't happen to you until the mind forgave the parents for the history.
Right. Right.
And so what happened? I said, because once it saw and the brain then awakened, it was no longer bound to literal time in the same way, but it was no longer repeating.
Yeah.
But it also freed the parents from the idea of repetition. You saw that they were people in a situation like you are.
Yeah, and that's been our process. So this is how you work with people, because everyone has the same story and a different story in that sense.
Freedom isn't licensed. Freedom gives you creative perspective.
Yeah.
And so then you are seeing something that the rest in the room don't see. You see that there's still there's feelings for you or this or that, but they're still literally tied to a situation, a historical situation, and that you've always brought them conflict because you've forced them to reconsider themselves. And you also said when you kind of got them to meet us in some way, that we were introducing that energy into the story. But whatever the story that came my way, whether it came in a right-wing story or left-wing story, whatever story I've had to meet.
But it's the purpose of incarnation to be free, or to go into the drama and be swept up and then free. You know, this is the.
You were doing something. And I say now, let's say there was a cop when I was a little kid who kicked the shit out of me or something. And it was normal.
Yeah.
And then I see the circumstance that I was in and what was happening. And I also saw how I was doing like a movie, taking it and letting them to not crying or whatever. And then so your incident happens where I saw a movie and I see a similar thing happen and it flashes back. And you see that you're not literal time, that you have evocative time. You can go back 50 years, 20 minutes into a future projection. You see that there's different you.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I see that, my eye forgave the story.
Mm.
Not that I forgave the story, but I saw the literalness of what I was in. The cop was doing cop, everyone was doing cop, but I also felt that there would be a memory where he would be ashamed of himself, waiting in the wing. So I then also felt that you also in your everyday life are also a memory.
Mm.
In fact, a major part of your life may be a memory. And a major part of most relationships may be an absence.
Yeah.
So aloneness is inherently in the story, even if the person goes out for the day and you're still related in absence. So that you see, but that death would be something, if your lover is in Paris, 5,000 miles away, it's still normal that they're still there, they still exist. But if they died in Paris, somehow the absence that was normal would be taken as loss.
Mm.
Even though much of it is memory, much of it is an absence. So if in fact you become aware of that much of your life has been in absence and in memory,
Yeah.
and it still carries on, the world still carries on in memory.
But I'm going to have to sit with that and integrate that and look at that to see where that lies in me. Sits.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
not doubting it. I just wanted to.
No, it is not, it's not a strict coda. It is something that we're sharing in the moment, but it's experiential. So somehow, what I'm saying is that the things that we're sharing, there will be a moment which kind of remembers what we were discussing.
Right.
Like I see something that we'll call it a holy shit moment, where you see something, I say, oh man, we were discussing that last month.
Right.
And you hear it manifest. That's how the sadhana works, actually. It's not a religion.
Yeah. Sadhana is life, and however it shows up is what I mean.
So let's say we were all in the same movie together and we all then have a memory of that movie. And all of us, even though whatever role we played in the movie, even if we were a plumber in the movie, we have a kind of pride in the creative act.
Right.
Because there was a shared experience that others didn't have, but we all did.
Right.
So if you bump into a person even 30 years later or 50 years later from that experience, your relationship is that experience.
Yes, happens all
When
the
I
time.
meet people over the years, over the quite a few, we're sugar to thousands of people that have come in and out, I may not see someone for 30 years, or my daughter dies, and all of a sudden people from 30 and 40 years ago come into the present.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Where there was no way that we could have met. But the passing of the girl and the affection that they had for her allowed a commonality. So you see how many parallel lives are being lived while one is living the everyday life of literalness.
Right. Even my connection with you after 20 years is from that past that now is re-engaged, but it's like time has not passed because we're having the same conversation in a good way. So it's like that is now.
It's as if it's as if we've been sitting on the park bench all that time.
Right.
And we're at the same time we lived a life, we're also still having that conversation as we're watching the world walk past us.
Right. And so.
Yeah. And somebody may, as they're walking past us and going about their business, someone may say, hey, what are you guys discussing? Someone may that you know or you remember. So you start to see then that the conversation has a kind of honesty to it. That's not strict honesty or military honesty, but has a creative honesty to it, where the inner life is revealed as the basis of the conversation, not the ego life.
Yeah, I'd like.
So when they say, what do you do? It's not that I have a job that I describe myself, that that's what I do. You see that the doing is an exploration of this life.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and in the exploration, you assume the identities necessary for the moment. But once that is truly happening, once you assume identities, there's relationships waiting for you. Say you get a job in the factory and you assume a job in the factory in order to earn a living, you understand there's a moment waiting with other people. So
Yeah.
somehow your presence, you see that most of the world is run through a kind of enslavement of fear that you need to earn a living, you have to protect the house and this, and so there's a fear underlying of continuity. So if someone says, hey, you're free, it becomes a real absurd idea because you're literally continuing some. But if the presence of the person is free, then you understand that they bring freedom into the room.
Mhm.
Once it comes into the room, then you're going to start to ask for humane treatment.
Right.
And you're going to see that the system is not based on humane treatment in that way. Meaning not giving you better rules or more money, but recognizing you as a true human being also. Not because of your class or circumstance being less than you. So you see your presence, I would say Kai's presence, interferes with the status quo that she'll step in, where they don't know what to do with her. When it's positive, a doorway opens up. When they're attempting to go on with their karma, she's a presence that's forcing them to look at what they're about and who they are.
Right.
And not, but you see that they're going to try to stylize it in an organized religion so they can get on with a shitty job and a crappy expression.
Yes.
But you say, no, there's a difference between being religious is that you can't force me into a false religion. So I see the yearning of the people in the religion. I see how there's a deep desire, but you see how deeply they're avoiding an honest conversation. So you see all of life is missing a heartfelt conversation. That hey baby conversation we were talking about seems to only come about when there's a disaster that has happened. Where they can say, I'm sorry, baby, for being such a jerk. And so you understand how it's determined to continue.
But your work is to have the hate.
If your situation, though, one thing that we won't be able to take, if hatred enters into the story, if you see glimmers of hatred entering into it, because your presence is too complicated for the status quo, if actual hatred enters into the story, you don't have to worry about how to get free or whatever.
But
it frees the story. But hatred is a tough one. It sends you to that initial hurt in your being. I heard kids describe when they were said that they were in Nazi Germany, that the other kids would spit at them and beat them up and spit at them. And there was such a hurt that ran through the normal every day. And they didn't understand, why were you spitting on, why are you spitting on me? Why are you doing, okay. So that there was a hurt, but they said once it reached a point of hate, you were dehumanized. Your humanization was completely gone in that hatred. And in that hatred, you experienced what it meant to be hell. You went sent immediately to a place that everyone is avoiding.
Right.
So you see, you are inhabiting a place that is being avoided.
So your work, though, is to have us have the hey baby conversation as our everyday expression. I mean, I'm not saying that's easy, but it's.
Well, I would say that there is a kind of, look, if the feeling was gone, we'll say we'll utilize Mary as the instrument. If she said one day, you old creep, get lost, or something like that, one day, and if I love you, baby, I love, and then all of a sudden the other, then I would be in a very dumb situation with big black dogs running around and country people and, okay, so in a cowboy movie. Okay, so let's say it would literalize. And if it literalized, we would all find ourselves in a dumb scene. In an old body, in a dumb situation.
Right.
Okay. So let's say the creative thread that runs through it allows a circumstance that would really be Meshuggah if it didn't have affection running through it.
Right.
And so we experience that in our life too, as it's coming and going, as the affection is coming and going, you feel coming and going in the literal world.
Mm.
So
Well-
then we see, okay, if in fact the business aspect of what folks are doing, where they have a store or they have, becomes the predominant thing or way of thinking, then it will create a hey baby conversation. Are we still into this? And I say, why? I say, because there's something about business that demands a continuity. There's
Right.
something about literal marriage that demands a continuity. But if in fact you have an agreement, let's try this thing. So you see, we'll utilize Kai again, how that's avoided. An honest conversation, even an honest conversation, but a heartfelt conversation would mean that you see the other as a thou, Buber's thou.
Mhm. Well,
That is a breakthrough in perception where the other, so in a love affair, the thou of the other becomes real to you. So there's a concern for you about the other and looking after them or whatever, as your normalcy. So that is a thou dialogue going on.
mm.
So
Well-
then you're not only moving from the self, you're moving from what is creatively good in the situation you're in.
Mhm.
So, and when we'll say the kids recognize that, you then have an I and thou conversation where it's one person to some degree in separate bodies, but they're one being.
Right. I think that's the ultimate point. Can we pick up this conversation again at some point?
Yeah, let's.
Yeah, we've been going for a while.
Yeah,
Kai,
let's just use this. We'll use this as practice.
okay.
And maybe
you.
you'll jump on the
Oh, yeah.
on the Zoom on Sunday or something.
Okay. I can't do this Sunday, but maybe the next Sunday.
And but anytime that and if you'd like it to be more, but thanks very much, Kai and Alan, for putting
Yeah.
this together.
Thank you, Danny,
Thank you.
so
No,
much.
it could be fun to have, and Mary,
Thank you, Mary.
and maybe to have more people jump in as a recording this way. We could do that too.
Yeah, and but I think then look at this big black dog.
You think, what were you
That's a
saying?
big black. That's actually named after my brother, Sammy.
Mm. No.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Kai. Any last?
Come in Alan, you're invited anytime.
Thank you.
You know, and I wouldn't mind if we'd like to develop it further. Let's see how it goes.
Yes. Thanks for
Okay.
your time. Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Kai, any final words?
Namaste.
No, just thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Danny. It was beautiful. I'm so excited. And we'll
And if-
see if it,
Very
see if
nice.
we
I
want to
was
go
really-
further.
I'm really
If I'm in
happy
New-
that we met again.
And if I'm in New Mexico,
Oh, you're always welcome. Knock on wood. How's your health, Alan?
it's good. It's good.
Yeah.
I'm staying out of the city mostly, so I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm glad. Good
Okay.
to connect with everyone.
Take care.
Thanks. Thanks.
I'll see you.
Thanks, Danny.
Bye.
Bye.
Mhm.